So this video is a continuation of the previous one, the humans as quantum beings, and this one is called Quantum Beings in Time. So in a previous video, we talked about how approximately 4 to 5% of the matter is detectable and 95% of matter and energy is undetectable. And of the 4 to 5% of matter that we can detect, it comes in two forms. The first form is a particle form, which is located in 3D space, and the second form is the wave or distributed form, which is located in time. In the last video, I proposed the hypothesis that we are quantum beings. I said that the human bodies have the particle nature related to three-dimensional space, and our consciousness has the wave or distributed nature related to time. But just how far does the distributed part of the universe, our consciousness, go? Like time, in our universe, it is everywhere. Motion links space and time. The scientist Dewey Larson proposed that motion, which is space divided by time, is the ratio of space to time. He proposed just as there is a familiar universe of 3D space and a variable of time, so there is a universe of 3D time and a variable of space interlinked to ours. It is undetectable to us, but the effects are detectable. In other videos on the matrix of time, I've explored how Larson equates space to 1 divided by time and time to 1 divided by space. That is, space and time have an inverse relationship. I've used his idea of two interlinked universes and expanded it into areas of human consciousness and other areas of physics. Now, in the previous Matrix of Time and the expanded Matrix of Time video series, I discussed Dewey Larson's idea of a second universe that's inversely related to ours. Now, typically when we think of another universe, like in this graphic in the top left, you can see that we have the familiar 3D space and time universe of matter that we are familiar with. And if there's another matter universe, this one in 3D time, we think of them as separated in space. But what I want you to do is think of them as being in the same space. We'll find out that our universe, the universe of 3D space, is 99% empty space, so that this other universe is interlinked and in the same place, the same space as our universe. So how do humans fit into this interlaced 3D space universe and 3D time universe? Let's go back and look at this slide where we looked at the perception where we had humans in the same time and different spaces. So everybody was watching the World Cup and they were watching it from all over the world. So they were in the same time in different spaces. How would this work with the interlaced universes? Well, here we show two humans that are very far apart in 3D space, but in 3D time, the consciousness of these humans can be very close together. Now we look at the other case where humans are very close in 3D space, but in 3D time, the consciousness of these humans can be very far apart. And this correlates to that previous example where everybody was in the same place being in the classroom, but their consciousness were very far apart in time. Now let's look at the quantum properties of both of these universes. The ones in our familiar universe of 3D space and time being everywhere are pretty familiar, but just for contrast, I'll go through it. So the local quantum property of matter is associated with three-dimensional space, and this non-local quantum property of matter is associated with time, which is everywhere. Now in this inverse universe of 3D time and space being everywhere, the local quantum property of matter is associated with three-dimensional time. Now I've put up some diffusers over these objects in 3D time with some question marks because it's not entirely clear to me exactly how these physical objects would look like in three-dimensional time. And the non-local quantum property of matter is associated with space, which is everywhere in 3D time. Now let's look at frequency, energy, and mass as properties of time. Frequency, which is also known as vibration, is equal to 1 divided by time. So frequency is a property of time. Energy is Planck's constant times frequency. It can be rewritten, since we know that frequency is 1 over time, that energy is equal to Planck's constant divided by time. Change the frequency and you change the energy, and therefore you change the geometry. Normally you do not think of musical notes as different energies, but they are. Now energy is also equal to mass times the speed of light squared. And if we rearrange that equation, we can see that mass is equal to energy divided by speed of light squared. If we replace energy with what we know is Planck's times frequency, and then replace frequency with 1 divided by time, we again see that mass is equal to Planck's constant divided by time times the speed of light squared. So mass is also a property of time. Resonance, a powerful effect, is based on frequency, and therefore so are energy and mass, which are all fundamental time properties. So 3 ideas that support consciousness fields as pattern generators. Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, in his book Morphic Resonance, proposes and discusses the following ideas that we'll consider in this video. 1. Morphogenic fields. Dr. Sheldrake postulates a field that influences the way a cell grows, in effect guiding the structure of the biological system. He also discusses biological structures from DNA and genes and the issues with that, and the limits of self-assembly. So let's look at number 1, morphogenic fields. The definition of a morphogenic field is coming into being of characteristic and specific form in living organisms. So the idea is that you have a field that holds the patterns and it guides the biology to create the correct biological structure. So Dr. Sheldrake proposes that morphogenic fields might be due to additional dimensions of space-time, a proposal that I really am in alignment with, or related to the quantum vacuum. The second approach, he referenced quantum theory where all electromagnetic fields are derived from the quantum vacuum. Now, continuing with morphogenic fields, Dr. Sheldrake has this to say about form and energy. In the most general terms, form and energy bear an inverse relationship to each other. Energy is the principle of change, but a form or structure can exist only as long as it has a certain stability and resistance to change. Now, I find this sentence extremely interesting, so let's break it down. So let's look at the first part of the sentence. Form and energy bear an inverse relationship to each other. In the other Matrix of Time videos, I've shown that space has an inverse relationship to time. Motion is space divided by time. In motion, more space is the same as less time. Therefore, space is equal to 1 divided by time, and time is equal to 1 divided by space. Let's look at the second part of his sentence. Energy is the principle of change. What I've put forward in these Matrix of Time videos is that energy is a property of time, and that time is change. Now let's look at the last part of his sentence, form or structure. Well, in these Matrix of Time videos, we've related form and structure as a property of space. So form and energy have the same relationship as space and time. Item number 2, biological structures from DNA and genes. So your arms and legs both contain identical cell types, muscle cells, connective tissues, etc., with identical proteins and identical DNA. Now you would expect that if you were going to create 2 sets of arms and legs, that you'd get 2 left arms and 2 left legs from the identical proteins and identical DNA, but we get a right arm, a left arm, a right foot, and a left foot. So all of this symmetry is worked out somewhere else. The way that Dr. Sheldrake states it, the differences between the arms and legs cannot be ascribed to DNA per se. They must be ascribed to pattern-determining factors that actually act differently in developing arms and legs. Item number 3, limits of self-assembly. So Dr. Sheldrake goes on to say that with the mechanistic view of science, that if you deliver all the materials on a pile and add the tools, you go away and with no intervention to design or build, and when you come back, you expect to see a fully constructed house. He says there are limits into the amount of self-assembly that's possible in biological structures without the guidance of a pattern generated at some level. So let's look at the impact of fields and time on biological structures. In this example, the patterns for the left and right arms and the left and right feet are in the fields of time, and when these are combined with the DNA, genes, and biochemistry, they form the correct body parts with all the proper symmetry for bones, soft tissue, nervous systems, etc. Remember, in time, frequency and energy create geometry. So let's combine multidimensional time and space. The design and patterns are held in the dimensions of time. These patterns guide the formation of biological growth of the physical in 3D space, as we talked about in the previous slide. So let's look at the diagram. Fields in multidimensional time hold all of the different patterns, and these are part of the fields of consciousness as well. And when you combine them with the biological materials and tools in multidimensional space, you get a properly constructed biological structure. Okay, this poor guy doesn't exactly look totally well proportioned, but you get the idea anyway. So let's revisit cymatics. Here we have 3D forms generated by time. Cymatics gives a simple example of how time in the form of frequencies can form patterns and therefore be the blueprint for materials and biological structures in our familiar 3D universe of space. Here we revisit Chladni patterns where time's interaction with matter creates geometry. You get completely different geometric forms due to very small changes in frequency. You can imagine if you have a symphony, a complex structure of frequency, that your geometrical patterns would become very complex. So let's expand the view of your consciousness. So far I've been using a pretty generic form to represent our consciousness, these green waves that are surrounding a human. But in time your consciousness can be thought of as more as music, like a symphony. Here each note represents a distinct energy and therefore a distinct geometrical structure. So you can imagine that all of these notes put together can create these complex geometric structures. A better representation of your field would be the one on the right with different layered structures. So a better view of your consciousness would be to think of it in terms of patterns that are built up from frequencies to create patterns of energy in these fields that would guide your development biologically, mentally, emotionally, and so on. Maybe these mental and emotional patterns in our consciousness could account for how children with identical DNA from parents and very similar nurturing can have such diverse mental and emotional behaviors. As you can see, these fields of consciousness in the secondary universe adds a whole new multidimensionality to us as human beings. So takeaway messages. We revisited the quantum properties of our familiar 3D space and time. A second universe was briefly described. There are plenty of details about the second universe of 3D time and space in the series of Matrix of Time videos. Quantum properties of both universes are discussed. We revisited how frequency, energy, and mass are properties of time. We evaluated 3 ideas from Dr. Rupert Sheldrake. First was morphogenic fields, second was the issues with DNA and genes, and the third was limits of self-assembly. We proposed how fields in time hold the patterns to guide the development of biological structures. We revisited cymatics and Chladni patterns and how when time interacts with matter, geometry is created. These geometries can be the patterns needed to guide not only our physical development, but possibly also mental and emotional developments. In the next video, we look into multidimensionality. If you want to hear more of these Matrix of Time videos, please subscribe below to be notified of new presentations. You can also go to my website, www.multidimensionaltime.com, and there you'll see that there's a book available. There's also some technical white papers, and all the links to my videos that are available on my YouTube channel can be found on my website. Okay, thank you very much.